The aging blacksmith believed his notorious reputation as the Ghost had died along with the screams of that fateful night at Thunder Valley, until a savage gang of outlaws forced him to prove why he was once the most feared man west of the Mississippi. Before we dive into this tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. The evening sun cast golden rays across Willow Creek's main street as the steady ring of hammer on anvil echoed through the dusty air. The rhythmic sound had become as familiar to the townspeople as church bells on Sunday morning. Inside his workshop, Marcus Cole shaped glowing metal with measured strikes, his weathered hands moving with the precision earned through years of honest labor. The blacksmith's broad shoulders, still powerful despite his graying hair, tensed slightly at the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared at his door, their shadows stretching across his workshop floor. Jake, Snake Eyes, Wilson and the Cutter twins dismounted, spurs jingling against the wooden steps. The smell of trail dust and cheap whiskey followed them into the shop. Marcus didn't look up from his work, though his calloused fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his hammer. These weren't the usual ranch hands or farmers who frequented his shop. These men carried trouble in their stance and death on their hips. "Hey, old-timer," Wilson called out, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Heard you're the only smithy tween here and Carson City." Marcus took his time responding, carefully adjusting the piece of metal he'd been shaping. "That's right," he replied, his voice gravelly from years of breathing forge smoke. The scars on his hands spoke of honest work, but there were older marks. Now there too, ones that told different stories. Roy Cutter, the younger of the twins, spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed deliberately close to Marcus's boots. "Need some work done. Heard you're cheap." "Fair prices for honest work," Marcus corrected, finally looking up. His steel-grey eyes, sharp despite his age, took in their well-worn gun belts and the way they positioned themselves around his shop. 20 years ago, he would have already mapped out firing angles and counted bullets, but those days were behind him, or so he'd thought. "Well then," Wilson stepped closer, floorboards creaking beneath his weight. "We need new shoes for 3 horses, and since we're just passing through your quaint little town, we'll be needing it done by sunrise." Marcus wiped his hands on his leather apron, noting how the older Cutter twin, Ray, kept his right hand hovering near his holster. "Got 5 jobs ahead of you," he said, gesturing to the row of waiting work. "Can't be done till end of week, that's just how it is." Ray Cutter's fingers drummed against his gun belt. "Maybe you need some motivation to adjust your schedule, old man." The movement didn't escape Marcus's notice. His grip tightened on the hammer he still held, muscle memory from another life flickering through his arms. Once, it would have been a gun he reached for instead. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The new voice came from the doorway, where Sheriff Daniel Morgan stood, his badge catching the late afternoon light. Marcus noticed how Wilson's hand moved away from his gun, though his smirk remained fixed in place. "No problem, Sheriff," Wilson replied smoothly, though his eyes held a predator's coldness. "Just discussing business with the blacksmith here, trying to work out a mutually beneficial arrangement." Morgan's eyes narrowed as he studied the 3 men. His right hand rested casually near his gun, but Marcus could see the tension in the young lawman's shoulders. "This is a peaceful town, boys. Let's keep it that way. Whatever business you have can wait till morning." The 3 men backed away, but Wilson paused at the door, his spurs making a final threatening jingle. "We'll be back at first light, old-timer. Best have those shoes ready. Hate to see anything happen to such a fine establishment." After they left, Morgan turned to Marcus, concern etched on his features. "You all right, Cole? Been dealing with their kind since before you were wearing that badge, Danny." Marcus picked up his hammer again, but his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of controlling the old instincts that had suddenly surged to life. The familiar weight of the hammer helped steady him, though it wasn't the kind of iron that had once made him legendary. "I know who they are," Morgan said quietly, moving closer to avoid being overheard. "Wilson and his gang have been terrorizing settlements up and down the territory. 3 stagecoach robberies in the last month, 4 men dead. They're getting bolder." Marcus nodded, already back at work, letting the rhythm of the hammer drown out the memories trying to surface. "Then you best keep an eye on the bank," he said evenly. "And you best be careful." "Those men don't take kindly to being refused," Morgan replied, his young face showing genuine concern. "They've been known to burn down businesses that don't cooperate." "I stopped being afraid of men like that a long time ago, Danny." Marcus's hammer struck the anvil with renewed force, drowning out any response the sheriff might have made. The sound echoed through the shop like distant gunfire. As Morgan left, Sarah Bennett, the town's schoolteacher, approached the shop carrying a broken school bell. She'd witnessed the entire exchange from across the street, and something about the way the old blacksmith had handled himself, the stillness, the control, the underlying tension, made her wonder if there was more to him than the quiet. "Man who fixed the town's metalwork. Mr. Cole," she called out softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the hammer. "Is this a bad time?" Marcus looked up, his expression softening slightly at the sight of her. Sarah was one of the few people in town who treated him like more than just the local smithy. "Never a bad time for you, Miss Bennett. What's broken today?" She held up the school bell, its brass surface dulled with age. "The clapper's come loose again, 4th time this month." As he took the bell from her hands, their fingers brushed briefly. Sarah noticed the old scars on his knuckles, scars that looked nothing like the burns and nicks that came from blacksmith work. These were the kinds of marks left by fighting, by violence, by a life lived hard and dangerous. "Those men," she said hesitantly, watching as he examined the bell with practiced care. They seemed dangerous. Marcus's eyes met hers for a moment, and Sarah saw something there, a flash of something cold and hard, like steel in winter. "Most men who try to look dangerous usually aren't, Miss Bennett," he said quietly. "It's the quiet ones you need to watch out for." He paused, turning back to his work. "Always the quiet ones." Something in his voice made Sarah wonder just how quiet Marcus Cole really was, and what storms lurked beneath that carefully maintained silence. As the sun began to set over Willow Creek, casting long shadows through the workshop windows, the steady ring of his hammer continued, each strike a reminder of the peace he'd found and the violence he'd left behind, or so he thought. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with a bitter chill that spoke of approaching autumn. The sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and gold, while long shadows still clung to the valley below. Marcus had already been at his forge for 2 hours when young Daniel Reed arrived for his morning apprenticeship. The boy's eager face was flushed from running, his patched clothes bearing the worn look of a widowed mother's best efforts. "Morning, Mr. Cole," Daniel burst in, reaching for his work apron. "The whole town's talking about those riders at the Golden Spur Saloon last night. Ma says they were causing all sorts of trouble, broke 3 chairs and threatened to shoot old Pete the bartender. And that's not even the worst of it. They said they'd be back to settle scores with anyone who crossed them." Marcus grunted, focusing on the piece of metal he was heating. The forge cast dancing shadows across the workshop walls, its warmth fighting back the morning chill. "Less gossip, more work. That plough blade won't fix itself." But he kept one eye on the street through the open shop door, watching the golden light creep across the dusty boards of the sidewalk. He'd spent a restless night, old memories stirring, like rattlesnakes in their den. His right hand had cramped twice, phantom pains from an injury 20 years old, earned in a gunfight most folks had forgotten. The steady rhythm of his hammer filled the shop, each strike precise and purposeful. Daniel watched in fascination as the metal began to take shape under his master's skilled hands. The boy had been apprenticing for 6 months now, and he'd never seen Mr. Cole waste a single movement. Everything the old blacksmith did carried the weight of years of experience. "Mr. Cole," Daniel's voice interrupted his thoughts, "have you ever met any famous gunfighters?" Marcus turned the metal in the forge, watching it glow orange-red. The heat made the old scars on his hands shine like silver in the morning light. "What makes you ask that?" "Well, Sheriff Morgan was talking to Doc Harrison yesterday. I heard him mention something about the Ghost and Thunder Valley. Was that—" The boy hesitated, eyes shining with curiosity. "Was that you they were talking about?" Before Marcus could answer, Sarah Bennett appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning sun. She carried her usual basket covered with a checkered cloth, and the smell of fresh-baked bread filled the shop. Her dark hair was neatly pinned back, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She had a way of bringing warmth to any room she entered, a warmth that had nothing to do with forges or fire. "Good morning, Mr. Cole, Daniel," she smiled warmly. "I brought you both some breakfast. Consider it payment for fixing the school bell so quickly. Miss Bennett, you don't need to—" Marcus started, but she cut him off with a gentle firmness that reminded him of someone from long ago. "Nonsense," she interrupted, setting the basket down on his workbench. "A man can't work on an empty stomach. Besides," her voice softened, "I wanted to make sure you were all right after yesterday. Those men, there was something dangerous about them. Something wrong." "Nothing special about it," Marcus muttered, though he accepted the bread she offered. His calloused fingers brushed against hers for a moment, and he quickly withdrew his hand. "Just an old man trying to run his business." Sarah studied him thoughtfully, her green eyes seeing more than he cared to show. "Is that all it was? Because I've been teaching here for 3 years, Mr. Cole, and I've never seen you back down from anyone. But I've never seen you afraid either. The way you handled them, it was like watching a wolf pretending to be a sheepdog. Fear's a luxury I gave up long ago, Miss Bennett." Marcus turned back to his forge, but Sarah noticed how his scarred hands trembled slightly as he picked up his tools. Not from fear, she was certain of that now, but from something else, something that looked a lot like restraint. The morning passed with deceptive quiet. Marcus showed Daniel how to properly shape metal for a plow blade, his patience evident in every instruction. The boy was a quick learner, eager to prove himself worthy of the trade. Sarah lingered longer than usual, grading papers at the corner of his workbench, occasionally glancing up to watch him work. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, an economy of motion that spoke of more than just blacksmith's training. Around noon, Sheriff Morgan stopped by, his expression grave. He'd aged 10 years overnight, worry lines etched deep around his eyes. "Marcus, got word from Pine Ridge. Wilson's gang hit the stagecoach 2 days ago. Left 3 passengers dead, including a woman and her child." Marcus continued working, but his hammer strikes became more forceful. The sound echoed through the shop like distant thunder. "That's Pine Ridge's business, not ours. Could be our business soon enough." Morgan lowered his voice, glancing at Sarah and Daniel. "Bank's getting a big shipment tomorrow. Wells Fargo wagon, usual route. Gold payment for the railroad workers. Wilson's boys were asking questions at the saloon last night. Then change the route," Marcus suggested, not looking up. But his hands had stilled on the hammer, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. Too late for that. Stage is already on its way. Morgan adjusted his gun belt nervously. "Just keep your eyes open, old friend, and maybe think about wearing iron again. Times like these, a man needs more than just a hammer at his side." Marcus's response was lost in the ring of steel on steel as he brought the hammer down with particular force. Morgan touched the brim of his hat to Sarah and left, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of impending trouble. He'd known men like Wilson before, had been the one to stop them back when his reputation alone was enough to make most outlaws think twice. The signs were all there, the questions about the bank, the show of force at the saloon, the way they'd tested him yesterday. They were planning something big, and they wanted him out of the way first. "Mr. Cole," Daniel's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "How come you never wear a gun? Most men around here do. Even Ma keeps a shotgun by the door since Pa died." Marcus glanced at Sarah, who had looked up from her papers with interest. The question hung in the air like forge smoke. "Because, Daniel, when a man carries iron on his hip, sooner or later he's expected to use it, and using it changes a man every single time, changes him in ways that can't be undone." "Is that why you became a blacksmith instead?" Sarah asked softly. "To work with a different kind of iron?" Marcus met her eyes, seeing understanding there rather than judgment. "Working iron's honest work, Miss Bennett. The only thing it kills is ignorance and rust." He turned back to his work, but his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "A man who shapes metal instead of drawing blood, he can look himself in the mirror come morning. Can't say the same for other trades I've known." Suddenly shots rang out from the direction of the bank. The sound shattered the peaceful afternoon like breaking glass. Marcus was moving before he consciously thought about it, his body remembering. Skills he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The old instincts flooded back, calculating angles, counting shots, mapping cover points. "Daniel, get in the back room. Miss Bennett, stay here." His voice had changed, taken on a harder edge that Sarah had never heard before. But Sarah was already at the window, her face pale but determined. "Mr. Cole, they're shooting at the bank. Sheriff Morgan's pinned down behind the water trough, and I think Deputy Hayes is hit." Marcus reached beneath his workbench, hesitating for just a moment before pulling out a hidden compartment. The wood slid back smoothly, well-oiled despite years of disuse. Inside lay an old gun belt, the leather, still supple and dark. The ivory-handled Colt gleamed dully in the forge light, its barrel inscribed with delicate scrollwork that looked suspiciously like the kind that adorned his finest metalwork. "Mr. Cole." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. She stared at a gun as if it were a snake about to strike. "Sometimes," he said quietly, buckling on the gun belt with practiced ease, "a man has to become what he's tried to forget to protect what matters now." The weight of it felt familiar, too familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend who'd tried to kill you once. He moved to the door with a grace that belied his age, the old weight on his hip as familiar as a curse. Outside, more shots echoed down the street, followed by screams. Wilson's gang had brought friends. He counted at least 6 horses tied outside the bank. The street had cleared except for Sheriff Morgan, who was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, and Deputy Hayes, who lay too still near the bank's front steps. "Stay here," he told Sarah firmly, "and keep Daniel in the back room. Whatever happens, don't come out until it's quiet." "Marcus," she caught his arm, and for the first time used his given name. "Be careful. This town needs its blacksmith." He gave her a grim smile that held no humor. "Careful got left behind in Thunder Valley, Miss Bennett, along with a lot of other things." He touched the ivory grip of his gun. Sometimes the only way to preserve peace is to remember how to wage war. As he stepped out onto the street, moving with the fluid precision of a man half his age, Sarah Bennett finally understood why they had called him the Ghost. Marcus Cole seemed to fade into the shadows, becoming something else entirely. Something dangerous, something deadly. Even the way he walked had changed, each step measured and silent, like a mountain lion stalking its prey. The gunfight that followed would be talked about in Willow Creek for years to come. Those who witnessed it spoke of how the quiet blacksmith moved like smoke between buildings, his shots coming from impossible angles. They said he never wasted a bullet, never made a wrong move. They said he was like a ghost, there and gone before you could blink. But that was still to come. For now, Marcus Cole walked down the dusty street of Willow Creek, every step taking him further from the peace he'd built, and closer to the man he'd tried so hard to bury. Behind him, the forge fire burned low, waiting for his return. If there was anything left of the blacksmith to return after the ghost finished his work. Sarah watched him go, the school bell he'd fixed sitting forgotten on the workbench. She understood now why he'd chosen to work with iron. It was the only thing strong enough to forge a new life from the ashes of the old. But as the gunfire intensified, she wondered if any amount of honest work could truly reshape a legend. The sun climbed higher over Willow Creek, and somewhere in the shadows the ghost rode again, drawn back into a dance of death he'd sworn he'd never perform again. The aftermath of the gunfight left Willow Creek in stunned silence. 4 of Wilson's men lay dead in the street, 2 more wounded and locked in Sheriff Morgan's jail. Deputy Hayes had survived, though Doc Harrison said it would be weeks before he could use his arm again. But it was the way Marcus Cole had handled himself that had the town buzzing with whispers and speculation. Sarah Bennett stood in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, watching Marcus clean his gun with practiced precision. His movements were methodical, almost meditative, as he wiped the bore and checked the action. The ivory-handled Colt looked at, home in his weathered hands, despite the 20 years it had spent hidden away. "You're not just a blacksmith, are you, Mr. Cole?" she asked softly. Marcus didn't look up from his work. "Haven't been just a blacksmith for a long time, Miss Bennett. But it's what I chose to be, and that means something. The way you moved. Out there." Sarah stepped closer, her skirts rustling against the wooden floor. "I've never seen anything like it. They called you the Ghost?" "Ghost of Thunder Valley." Marcus nodded, finally meeting her eyes. Papers made it sound grander than it was. Just a man doing what needed doing in a time when such things were common. Daniel Reed burst into the shop, his young face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Cole, the whole town's talking about how you saved Sheriff Morgan. Billy Thompson says you shot the gun right out of that outlaw's hand and then disappeared like smoke when his friend tried to draw on you." "Billy Thompson talks too much," Marcus growled, but there was a hint of affection in his voice. "And you're late for your lessons. That steel won't shape itself." As Daniel hurried to don his apron, Sarah noticed how Marcus's eyes followed the boy, watching with a protective intensity that spoke of more than just a master's concern for his apprentice. "He reminds you of someone, doesn't he?" Marcus's hands stilled on the gun. "Had an apprentice once back in Thunder Valley. James. Good kid, quick learner. Too quick, maybe." He holstered the Colt with a smooth motion and hung the gun belt on. "A peg. Some skills are better left unlearned." What happened to him? Same thing that happens to most young men who learn to be too fast with a gun. Found a faster man. Marcus turned to the forge, stirring the coals to life. "That's why I teach honest work now. Man who knows how to create doesn't feel the need to destroy." The morning passed in a rhythm of hammer strikes and lessons. Marcus showed Daniel how to fold steel, explaining how each strike strengthened the metal, how impurities were worked out through patient effort. Sarah graded papers at her usual corner of the workbench, but her attention kept drifting to the old blacksmith. Around midday, Sheriff Morgan stopped by, his arm in a sling. "Marcus, got a moment?" They stepped outside into the autumn sunlight. The street had been cleaned, but dark stains still marked the dirt where blood had soaked in. "Town council's been talking," Morgan said quietly, "about what happened yesterday, about who you really are. Been who I am for 20 years, Danny. Yesterday doesn't change that. Maybe not, but Wilson's got friends, mean ones. Word'll spread about what happened here, and they'll come looking for the ghost." Marcus watched a group of children playing near the schoolhouse. their laughter carrying on the breeze. Then they'll find a blacksmith, nothing more. You really believe that? Morgan asked. After yesterday? Have to. Alternative's not something this town needs. Marcus turned back to his shop, but Morgan caught his arm. Town needs you, Marcus, not just your forge work. Maybe it's time to stop pretending you're just a blacksmith. Inside, Daniel was attempting his first solo project, a simple horseshoe. His face was screwed up in concentration as he worked. The metal, Sarah had moved closer to watch, offering quiet encouragement. That's what I'm afraid of, Marcus muttered. The afternoon brought more visitors. Ranchers and farmers came with work orders, but their eyes strayed to the gun belt hanging on its peg. Some offered awkward thanks for yesterday's events. Others just stared, trying to reconcile the quiet blacksmith with the deadly gunman they'd glimpsed. "Mr. Cole," Daniel asked during a break, "will you teach me to shoot like that?" The question hung in the air like forge smoke. Sarah looked up sharply from her papers, watching Marcus's reaction. "No," Marcus said firmly. "I'll teach you to work steel, to create things that help people live. But that other skill, that's for dying, and you've got too much living ahead of you." "But what if more bad men come? Like Wilson's gang?" Marcus set down his hammer and knelt before the boy. "Daniel, listen close. Every man's got to choose what kind of mark he leaves on the world. Could teach you to be fast with a gun, sure, but that path, it takes more than it gives. Better to be known as a man who builds than one who breaks. Is that why you stopped being the ghost?" Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was listening intently. "Part of it. Thunder Valley taught me some hard lessons about the price of reputation. But what happens when legends overshadow the men beneath them?" "Will you tell us," Sarah asked softly, "about Thunder Valley?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The forges crackled, the only sound in the shop. Finally, he picked up a piece of raw iron, holding it up to the light. "See this? Looks rough, ugly, even. But with time, with work, you can shape it into something useful, something good." He placed it in the forge. 20 years ago, I was like that iron, crude, violent, thinking strength came from how much damage you could do." He worked as he talked, hammer striking in rhythm with his words. "Thunder Valley was a mining town, rough place. Law couldn't handle the gangs that preyed on the miners, so they called for help, called for the ghost." "Why did they call you that?" Daniel asked, entranced. "Because no one ever saw me coming. Would appear out of nowhere, deal with the trouble, fade away. Again, built quite a reputation that way, too much of one. The iron began to take shape under his hammer. There was a gang, led by a man named Blackjack Turner, mean as a rattler, twice as quick. He'd killed 11 men in fair fights, more in ambush. Town wanted him gone." "Did you kill him?" Daniel whispered. "No," Marcus said softly. "Worse. I waited for him to draw first, then shot his gun hand off. Should have killed him. Man like that, mercy's not always a kindness." "What happened?" "He healed up, learned to shoot with his left hand. Came back 6 months later with 20 men, burned half the town, killed anyone who'd helped me, including James, my apprentice." Marcus's hammer struck harder. "By the time I got there, it was too late. Found Turner in the street, holding James's mother hostage. The shop was silent except for the ring of hammer on steel. Killed him then, and most of his men. Papers called it justice, called me a hero." His voice turned bitter. 15 men dead, good people's lives destroyed, all because I thought reputation was more important than wisdom. After that," Marcus continued, shaping the glowing metal with practiced strokes, "I couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. The ghost had brought death to those he'd sworn to protect. So I buried him, along with my guns and my reputation, found this town, built this forge, thought I could reshape myself like I reshape iron." Sarah moved closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You have, Mr. Cole. Yesterday proved that. You didn't fight for glory or reputation. You fought to protect people. Maybe, Marcus admitted, examining the piece he'd been working. But violence has a way of following a man, no matter how far he runs. Wilson's friends will come, sure as sunset, and they won't care that I'm just a blacksmith now. Daniel had been unusually quiet, absorbing the story. Now he spoke up, his young voice thoughtful. But you're not just a blacksmith, Mr. Cole. You're both, the man who creates and the man who protects. Isn't that better than being just one or the other, Marcus? And Sarah exchanged surprised looks at the boy's insight. When did you get so wise, lad? Marcus asked, a faint smile touching his weathered face. Learned from the best, sir. Daniel grinned. Now, are you going to show me how to finish this horseshoe, or are we going to stand around talking all day? The tension broke, and Marcus laughed, a real laugh that seemed to shed years from his face. Cheeky apprentice. All right, let's see what you've managed to mangle while I was telling old stories. As they returned to work, Sarah watched the interaction with new understanding. She saw how Marcus was trying to forge something more precious than iron here, a legacy of creation rather than destruction, passed down through teaching rather than violence. The afternoon sun slanted through the shop windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The gun belt still hung on its peg, but it seemed less threatening now, more like a reminder than a promise. The steady rhythm of hammers filled the air, master and apprentice working in harmony, shaping metal and futures with equal care. "Miss Bennett," Marcus called out suddenly, "that school bell's not going to fix itself, you know." Sarah smiled, recognizing the invitation in his gruff words. "Well then, Mr. Cole, perhaps it's time you showed me how it's done. After all, a teacher should know how to maintain her own tools." As Marcus began explaining the intricacies of bell repair to Sarah, with Daniel adding his own newly learned insights, the shop felt different. Warmer somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the truth of his story and were holding it close, adding it to the layers of history that made this place more than just a workplace. The ghost of Thunder Valley might still haunt the territories, but here in Willow Creek, Marcus Cole had forged something stronger than legend. He'd forged a family. And as the day drew to a close, the old blacksmith realized that perhaps this was the real redemption he'd been seeking all along, not in the burying of his past, but in using it to protect and nurture the future he'd built, one hammer stroke at a time. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with heavy clouds threatening rain. Marcus stood at his forge earlier than usual, his weathered hands moving through the familiar motions of stoking the fire. But his mind was elsewhere, remembering the weight of the gun belt that now hung silent in its place on the wall. Word of yesterday's gunfight had spread fast, carried by telegraph wires and rushing stagecoach drivers. The ghost of Thunder Valley had risen again, and there would be consequences. Sheriff Morgan burst through the door, his face ashen in the forge's glow. "Marcus, we've got trouble. Big trouble." Wilson's friends. Marcus didn't look up from his work, but his hands stilled. On the bellows. "Worse. Just got a wire from Carson City. Blackjack Turner's son is coming, and he's bringing the Savage brothers with him." The hammer in Marcus's hand fell to the dirt floor with a dull thud. Turner had no son. He did. Boy was back east with his mother when you killed his father. He's been making quite a name for himself these past few years. Calls himself Young Jack Turner. Morgan pulled out the telegram, his hands shaking slightly. "They say he's faster than his father ever." Was. Marcus picked up the hammer, studied it as if seeing it for the first time. "How many?" "Turner and all 3 Savage brothers, maybe more. Word is they've been waiting years for a chance like this, waiting for the ghost to show himself again." The shop's door creaked open and Sarah Bennett stepped in, carrying her usual basket. She stopped short at the tension in the air. "What's wrong?" Before either man could answer, more hoofbeats approached. A rider appeared in the doorway. Ted Miller, one of Morgan's deputies. "Sheriff, Just spotted riders coming in from the north. 4 men, heavily armed. They're heading for the Golden Spur. Marcus moved with swift precision, checking the windows and doors. Danny, get Sarah and Daniel to the church. Tell everyone to clear the streets. Marcus, Sarah protested, you can't face them alone. Not your fight, Miss Bennet. Her eyes flashed with anger. It became my fight when you saved this town yesterday, when you showed us who you really are. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. Marcus turned to face her fully. The man I really... he's the reason Turner's coming. Everything I touch turns to blood in the end. That's not true. Daniel's voice came from the back door. The boy stood there, clutching his work apron. You taught me that a man's worth isn't in how much he can destroy, but in what he can build. Wise words, a new voice drawled from the street. Shame they're wasted on a coward who shoots men from the shadows. Marcus turned slowly. A young man stood in the doorway, barely more than 20. His face bore a striking resemblance to Jack Turner, but there was something harder in his eyes, something that spoke of carefully nurtured hatred. Young Jack, I presume, Marcus said quietly, in the flesh. Turner's hand rested casually on his gun. Though I prefer to go by the judge these days, seeing as how I've made it my life's work to pass sentence on men who need judging. Behind him loomed the 3 Savage brothers, each carrying 2 guns and wearing matching black dusters. They be spread out, blocking any escape through the front of the shop. Sarah, Marcus said softly, take Daniel and go out the back, now. Too late for that, Ghost. Young Jack smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Already got men watching the back. Nobody leaves until we settle up. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. The gun belt was still hanging on its peg, too far to reach without causing a bloodbath. But there were other weapons in a blacksmith shop, hammers, pokers, hot metal ready to be shaped. Your father drew first, Marcus said evenly. Ask anyone who was there. Oh, I did. Asked everyone I could find who survived that day. Most told the same story, about how the ghost appeared from nowhere, shot my father's hand off just to prove he could. How he left him alive, broken, knowing he'd never hold a gun right again. Young Jack's voice hardened. How he came back 6 months later to finish the job, killing my father and 15 other men. Your father burned half a town and murdered innocent people for revenge, including a boy about your age, my apprentice. And now I've got a new story to tell. Young Jack continued as if Marcus hadn't spoken, about how the ghost tried to hide behind an honest trade, pretending to be something he's not. About how justice finally caught up with him. There's women and children in this town, Marcus warned. Whatever you're planning, keep it between us. Young Jack laughed, and the sound sent chills down Sarah's spine. Just like there were women and children in Thunder Valley? No, Ghost. You don't get to choose how this ends. The only choice you get is whether you die like a man or a coward. Marcus felt the familiar calm settling over him. The stillness that came before violence. Sarah, Daniel, back room now, Mr. Cole. Daniel started to protest. Do as he says, boy, young Jack cut in, unless you want to end up like his last apprentice. Sarah grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him toward the back room, her eyes meeting Marcus's for a moment. In that glance, he saw something that gave him pause. Not fear, but fierce determination. You boys seem awful sure of yourselves, Marcus said, turning back to young Jack. 4 against 1, guns already in hand. Not exactly the kind of odds that make legends. We're not here for legend-making, old man, the eldest Savage brother growled. We're here for revenge. Funny thing about revenge, Marcus moved slowly, positioning himself between the gunman and the back room. It has a way of blinding a man, making him stupid. His hand brushed against a hammer on the workbench, making him miss things he ought to notice. Only thing I notice, young Jack sneered, is a tired old killer trying to buy time. What's wrong, Ghost? Lost your nerve along with your speed? Marcus smiled then, and it was not the smile of a simple blacksmith. Son, you've got it all backwards. The ghost wasn't what made me dangerous. It was what made me merciful. The forge fire suddenly exploded in a shower of sparks as Sarah, understanding Marcus's intent, threw a bucket of water onto the hot coals. Steam filled the shop, and in that moment of confusion, Marcus moved. The hammer left his hand with deadly accuracy, catching the youngest savage brother in the chest. Before the others could react, Marcus had rolled behind his anvil, another hammer already in hand. Shots rang out, filling the shop with thunder and gun smoke. "That the best you can do, Ghost?" young Jack's voice called out through the steam, throwing hammers like a common brawler. "You wanted the legend," Marcus called back, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Should have asked yourself why they called me the Ghost." More shots, more misses. The steam was beginning to clear, but Marcus was no longer behind. The anvil! The savage brothers moved further into the shop, guns trained on shadows. "Enough games," young Jack shouted. "Face me like a man." "I'm facing you like a man," Marcus's voice came from behind him. "Like a man who's learned there's more than one kind of strength." Young Jack spun, but it was too late. Marcus stood there, the gun belt now secure around his waist, the ivory-handled Colt aimed steady at Turner's chest. "Your father died because he couldn't let go of his pride," Marcus said quietly. "Don't make the same mistake. Take your men and ride out. Find something. Better to build your life around than revenge. Like you did." Young Jack's hand twitched near his gun, hiding behind a blacksmith's apron, pretending to be something you're not. "Not hiding," Marcus corrected. "Becoming something better, something my last apprentice would have been proud of." His voice hardened. "Now choose, boy. Ride out or join your father." For a long moment the only sound was the hiss of dying embers in the forge. Then young Jack's hand moved, faster than a striking snake. But the ghost was faster. The shot echoed through the shop like Judgment Day. Young Jack's gun went spinning, a perfect hole drilled through the cylinder. The savage brothers stared in disbelief as their leader clutched his unharmed hand, face white with shock. "That's twice now a Turner's drawn first on me," Marcus said, softly. "Twice. I've chosen not to kill. Don't make me choose a third time." Young Jack looked at his fallen gun, then at the steady black eye of Marcus's Colt. Something changed in his face, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. "Mount. Up," he ordered his men, his voice shaking slightly. "This isn't over, Ghost." "Yes, it is," Marcus replied. "Because next time I won't be so merciful, and neither will the town I'm protecting." As the riders cleared out, Sarah and Daniel emerged from the back room. The shop was a mess of bullet holes and scattered tools, but Marcus stood unchanged, as solid as his own anvil. "Mr. Cole," Daniel breathed, that was the past, trying to claim the future, boy." Marcus holstered his gun with fluid grace. "Sometimes you have to face it head on, but you don't have to let it win." Sarah touched his arm gently. "Will they be back?" Marcus looked at the gun belt, then at the hammer lying in the dirt. "Maybe, but they'll find the same thing waiting for them. Not a ghost, not a legend, just a blacksmith protecting what's his." The sun broke through the clouds outside, sending shafts of light through the bullet holes in the walls. In their glow, Marcus Cole stood tall, a man who had finally found the balance between what he was and what he had become. Word of the confrontation at the blacksmith shop spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By sunset, 3 different versions of the story were making rounds in the Golden Spur saloon. Some said the ghost had appeared and disappeared like smoke, killing all 4 men. Others claimed Marcus Cole had faced down young Jack Turner with nothing but a hammer. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Sheriff Morgan stood in the doorway of the shop, watching Marcus repair the bullet-riddled walls. Sarah Bennett sat at her usual spot, but instead of grading papers, she was cleaning Marcus's gun, a task she'd insisted on learning after the shooting. "Town council's called a meeting," Morgan announced. "They want to talk about what happened today, about who you really are." Marcus drove another nail into a patchboard. Already told them who I am. 20 years of honest work ought to count for something. It does, Sarah spoke up, carefully oiling the Colt's action. But they're scared, Marcus. Young Jack Turner, the Savage Brothers. These are names that make people nervous. They want to know what we're facing. What we're facing. Marcus turned, catching her use of we. There is no we in this, Miss Bennet. This is my past coming. To collect its due. Like hell it is. Sarah's voice carried an unexpected steel. This town, these people, we're not just going to stand by while you face this alone. Before Marcus could respond, Daniel burst into the shop, his young face flushed with excitement. Mr. Cole, someone's here to see you, says he's from Thunder Valley. An old man stood in the doorway, leaning on a wooden cane. His clothes were trail-worn, but good quality. Grey hair hung past his shoulders, and a magnificent white mustache dominated his weathered face. Been a long time, Ghost, the old man said softly. Marcus straightened slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. Judge Harrison, I thought you were dead. Not for lack of trying. The old man limped into the shop. Heard talk in Carson City about the ghost showing himself again. Had to see for myself. Sarah watched the exchange with intense interest. This was someone who knew Marcus from before, someone who might finally fill in the gaps in his story. Miss Bennett Daniel, Marcus said quietly, would you give us a moment? Actually, Judge Harrison interrupted, they might want to hear this. Time the whole story was told, don't you think? Marcus was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Pull up some chairs. This might take a while. As they settled in, the judge pulled out an old leather portfolio. Brought something you might want to see, Ghost. Or should I say Marshal Cole? Sarah's head snapped up. Marshal? That part never made it into the dime novels. The judge smiled sadly. They preferred their lone gunman legend. Truth is, Marcus, Cole was a U.S. Marshal for 12 years before Thunder Valley, one of the best. They called him the Ghost because he could track men across impossible terrain, appear out of nowhere to make arrests. He never killed unless he had to. Until Thunder Valley, Marcus said quietly. Until Thunder Valley, the judge agreed. He opened the portfolio, spreading out yellowed newspaper clippings and wanted posters. But they got that story wrong too, didn't they? Marcus stood and walked to his forge, stirring the coals. The fire cast dancing shadows across his face, making him look older, wearier. Does it matter any more? What's done is done. It matters, Sarah said firmly. It matters to us. The judge nodded approvingly. Smart woman, yes, it matters, because young Jack Turner's been raised on a lie, and that lie's going to get more people killed unless the truth comes out. He pulled out a specific document. An official report, the edges charred. This is my official account of what happened in Thunder Valley, the one that never made it to the territorial governor because Black Jack Turner's men burned the courthouse before it could be sent. Daniel leaned forward eagerly. What really happened, sir? The judge looked at Marcus, who gave a slight nod. The ghost, Marshal Cole, wasn't in Thunder Valley by chance. He was there investigating a series of gold shipment robberies, brutal ones. Whole camps wiped out, men, women, and children. Black. Jack Turner, Sarah guessed. His gang, yes. But Turner was just the gun. The real mastermind was the town banker, Howard Maxwell. He was using Turner's reputation and violence to cover his own theft of mining payrolls. Marcus's hammer struck the anvil, the sound like distant thunder. Maxwell was respected, pillar of the community. Nobody suspected him. Until the ghost started putting it together, the judge continued. He was close to proving it when Turner's gang hit the school. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The school? Maxwell's last big score was supposed to be the mining company's quarterly payroll. He'd arranged for it to be stored in the school basement during a town celebration. Thought nobody would think to guard it there. But somebody did, Daniel. said softly, looking at Marcus. "James," Marcus confirmed, his voice rough with memory. "My apprentice. Smart boy. Too smart. He'd seen Maxwell meeting with Turner late at night. Told me his suspicions." The judge picked up the story. Marshal Cole posted James as a secret watcher at the school. The boy was supposed to signal if he saw anything suspicious. Instead he tried to stop them himself. Marcus's words were heavy with old pain. Turner caught him, used him as a hostage to force the teacher to open the safe. Then he killed them both, the judge finished quietly, along with 3 other children who were there early for the celebration. The silence in the shop was broken only by the crackle of the forge. Sarah's hands had stilled on the gun she was cleaning, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Daniel stood rigid, his young face pale with horror. "After that," the judge continued, "the ghost did what he had to do. But it wasn't murder, and it wasn't revenge. It was justice." "Maxwell tried to run," Marcus said, his voice distant, as if seeing it all again. "Turner, too. They split up, thinking I couldn't chase them both. But Maxwell made a mistake. He went to the bank first, trying to grab what gold he could carry. And Turner," Sarah asked softly, "headed for the school. Thought he could use more hostages to buy his escape. Found me waiting instead." Marcus turned from the forge, his eyes hard with memory. "That's when he drew first. That's when I shot his gun hand off. But you let him live," Daniel said. "Why?" "Because killing him would have been mercy. I wanted him to live with what he'd done, wanted him to face justice in a courtroom alongside Maxwell." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Another mistake." The judge nodded grimly. "Turner escaped during transport, came back 6 months later with his gang, looking for revenge. But by then, Maxwell had already confessed everything. The town knew the truth. Fat. Lot of good that did them." Marcus's voice was heavy with guilt. "Turner burned half the town anyway, killed anyone who'd helped me expose Maxwell. I got there too late to stop most of it." "But you stopped him," Sarah said. "You stopped Turner." "Yes, him and most of his gang. The papers called it a victory, called me a hero." Marcus picked up his hammer again, testing its weight. "They didn't see the bodies, didn't have to write letters to parents explaining why their children weren't coming home." "And young Jack?" Daniel asked. "Why doesn't he know all this?" "Because his mother never told him," the judge explained. "She'd left Turner years before, couldn't stand his cruelty. Raised the boy back east on stories about his father's noble death at the hands of a coward who shot from shadows. By the time I tracked them down to tell them the truth, the boy was already gone, already set on his path of revenge." Marcus set down his hammer with careful precision. "So now you know the whole truth. The ghost wasn't just a gunfighter. He was a lawman who failed to protect the people who trusted him, who's been trying to make up for it ever since." Sarah stood and walked to Marcus, placing her hand on his arm. "No, he was a man who tried to do right, who's been carrying the weight of other men's evil for 20 years, and it's time to put that weight down. The boy's going to come back," Marcus warned, "and this time he'll bring more than just the Savage brothers." "Let him come," Sarah's voice was firm. "But this time, you're not facing it alone. This time the whole town will know the truth, and we'll stand with you." The judge smiled, gathering his papers. "Told you she was smart." He turned to go, then paused. "One more thing, Ghost. Maxwell escaped prison last month. Word is he's been seen riding with young Jack's gang." Marcus's hand went to his gun, an unconscious gesture. "History has a way of repeating itself." "Then maybe it's time to change the ending," Sarah suggested. "This time, let's write it our way." As the judge limped away, the truth of Thunder Valley hung in the air like forge smoke. But something else hung there too. Hope, determination, and the strength of a community united behind their blacksmith. The ghost of Thunder Valley might ride again, but this time he wouldn't ride alone. The morning after Judge Harrison's revelations dawned cold and misty. Willow Creek lay shrouded in fog, the kind that turns familiar shapes into lurking shadows. Marcus stood at his forge before sunrise, the fire casting an orange glow through the mist. The truth about Thunder Valley had spread through town overnight, carried by whispers and worried glances. Sheriff Morgan arrived first, his boots marking a steady rhythm on the wooden sidewalk. "Got word from Carson City. Maxwell's definitely with them. They hit a bank in Silver Springs 2 days ago. 3 dead." Marcus nodded, continuing his work on a piece of glowing metal. History repeating itself. "Not this time," Morgan replied firmly. "Town council met at dawn. They've deputized every able man who can shoot. We've got 30 volunteers ready to help defend Willow Creek." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah Bennett hurried into the shop, her face flushed from the cold morning air. "The stagecoach just arrived. You need to see this." She handed Marcus a newspaper from Carson City. The headline made his blood run. Cold. "Ghost of Thunder Valley returns. Notorious gunman terrorizes peaceful town." "Maxwell's work," Marcus growled, crumpling the paper, "trying to turn public opinion against us before they make their move." "There's more," Sarah said quietly. "The paper claims you murdered Turner in cold blood, that you've been hiding here, planning more killings. They're calling for a territorial marshal to come arrest you." Daniel burst into the shop out of breath. "Riders coming, at least 10 of them, from the north." Marcus moved with fluid grace, checking his gun before buckling on the belt. "Get everyone off the streets. Sarah, take Daniel to the church." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're done hiding. The town needs to see we stand with you." The riders appeared, out of the fog like specters, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth. Young Jack Turner led them, the Savage brothers flanking him. Behind them rode a grey-haired man in an expensive coat, Howard Maxwell, his banker's hands now adorned. With gun calluses, they reined up in front of the blacksmith shop, spreading out across the street. Townspeople watched from doorways and windows, many holding rifles ready. "Quite a welcome committee," Maxwell called out, his cultured voice carrying easily. "Almost like you were expecting us." "Been expecting you for 20 years, Howard," Marcus replied, stepping onto the street. "Finally found the courage to face me yourself, instead of hiding behind hired guns?" Maxwell smiled thinly. "Oh, I'm not here to fight, Marshal. I'm here to see justice done." He held up a paper. "I have here a warrant for your arrest, signed by the territorial governor himself. Seems your recent activities have caught official attention." "That warrant's as false as everything else about you, Maxwell." Sheriff Morgan stepped forward, badge gleaming. "This is my jurisdiction, and Marcus Cole is a free man here." "Is he?" Young Jack sneered. "Tell that to my father. Tell that to the people he's killed. Tell it to the children your father murdered." Sarah's voice rang out clear and strong. She stood in the shop doorway, Daniel beside her. "Tell it to the families who died because of your father and this man's greed." Maxwell's smile faltered slightly. "Ah, the school teacher. Miss Bennett, isn't it? You should be careful about choosing sides. Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to your students." Marcus's gun cleared leather so fast it seemed to materialize. In his hand. "Threaten the children again, Howard, and we'll finish this right now." The street grew tense, hands hovering over weapons. But young Jack raised his hand, holding his men back. "Not yet, Ghost. We're not here to fight, just to deliver. A message." He tossed a sealed envelope into the dirt. "You've got 1 hour to surrender yourself. After that we start burning buildings, starting with the school." "You really are your father's son," Marcus said quietly. "Same stupid pride, same fatal mistake. Thinking I'm alone this time." As if to emphasize his point, townspeople began, emerging from buildings, rifles and shotguns at ready. Men and women both, shopkeepers and farmers, all standing firm. "Look around, Jack," Marcus continued. "These people know the truth about Thunder Valley, about what your father really was. what Maxwell really is. You want to burn their town, they'll burn you right back. They'll burn. Maxwell's composure cracked slightly. These people don't know anything. They're protecting a murderer, a man who kills from the shadows. No, Howard, Marcus replied evenly. They're protecting their own, something you never understood, not even in Thunder Valley. That's why you had to hire killers to do your dirty work, why you let children die to cover your greed. Young Jack's face showed confusion for the first time. What's he talking about, Maxwell? He's lying, boy, just like he lied about your father. Tell him, Howard, Marcus pressed. Tell him about the school, about the gold you hid there, about the children your hired guns murdered to keep your secret. Don't listen to him, Jack. Maxwell's voice rose, losing its cultured edge. He's trying to turn you against me, just like he turned the territory against your father. But doubt had crept into young Jack's eyes. He looked at the school building, then at Sarah and Daniel, then back at Maxwell. The school? You said my father died defending the bank. Because that's what happened. Maxwell was sweating now, despite the cold. Turner died a hero trying to stop this killer. No, Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension. The old man stepped out of the crowd, leaning on his cane. Your father died a murderer, boy, but not by choice, by Maxwell's orchestration. I have proof, if you're man enough to face the truth. Young Jack's hand strayed toward his gun, then stopped. What proof? Your father's own words. The judge pulled out a yellowed letter, written from prison before he escaped, telling the whole story about how Maxwell used him, betrayed him, left him to take the blame. I've been carrying it for 20 years, waiting for you to be ready to hear it. The street held its breath. Young Jack stared at the letter, conflict clear on his face. Behind him, the Savage brothers exchanged uncertain glances. Don't be a fool. Boy! Maxwell drew his gun, but before he could aim, Marcus's shot knocked it spinning into the dust. That's twice I've disarmed a man rather than kill him, Marcus said quietly. Don't make me choose differently this time. Young Jack looked at his fallen mentor, then at the letter in the judge's hand. Slowly, he dismounted. I want to read it. All of it. Jack, you can't believe. Maxwell started, but the Savage brothers had already moved away from him, sensing the changing tide. Mr. Turner, Marcus said formally, your father was a violent man, but he had his own kind of honor. He admitted his crimes in the end. Question is, are you man enough to face the truth he couldn't until it was too late? The fog began to lift as young Jack walked toward the judge, leaving Maxwell isolated in the street. The old banker's face twisted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed vengeance was unraveling. This isn't over, Ghost, he spat, wheeling his horse around. No, Marcus agreed, watching him ride away. But it's a start. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah touched Marcus's arm. Will Maxwell be back? Count on it. Men like him can't let go of their hate. It's all they have left. But looking at the town gathered around him, at Sarah's steady presence and Daniel's admiring gaze, Marcus Cole knew that he had something stronger than hate. He had truth, he had purpose, and most importantly, he had people worth protecting. The Ghost of Thunder Valley might have one more battle ahead, but this time the shadows he fought from were cast by honest men standing in the light. Inside Judge Harrison's office, young Jack Turner sat motionless, his father's letter trembling in his hands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows as he read the words for the third time. Marcus stood by the door, watching the young man's world reshape itself one painful truth at a time. All these years, Jack's voice was barely a whisper, everything I believed about him, about you, it was all Maxwell's lies. Not all of it, Marcus replied quietly. Your father was a violent man, made his choices long before Maxwell got his hooks in him. But he wasn't the monster some made him out to be, nor the hero others claimed. Sarah Bennett entered with fresh coffee, her presence somehow softening the tension in the room. "He was just a man," she said gently, "who made terrible mistakes, and paid for them." Jack looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "The children in the school, did they suffer?" "Don't do that to yourself, boy," Marcus warned. "Some ghosts you don't want to carry." "Like you've carried them," Jack challenged. 20 years of hiding in a blacksmith shop trying to forget?" "Not hiding," Sarah corrected firmly. "Building, creating instead of destroying. There's a difference." Outside, the town was preparing for Maxwell's return. Sheriff Morgan had organized volunteers into patrols, while others reinforced buildings and stockpiled ammunition. The rhythmic sound of hammering drifted through the windows. Daniel and other apprentices helping to board up vulnerable windows. "Maxwell won't come alone," Jack said finally. "He's got connections, friends in low places. He'll bring an army." "Let him," Marcus replied. "This time we're ready. This time the truth rides with us." "Truth?" Jack laughed bitterly. "Truth got those children killed in Thunder Valley. Truth got my father shot. Truth is just words, Ghost. Bullets are real." Marcus moved to the window, watching his town prepare for war. 20 years ago, I thought like you, thought justice came from the barrel of a gun. Cost me everything I cared about." He turned back to face Jack. "Then I learned there's more than one way to fight evil, more than one way to be strong." "The Savage brothers rode out an hour ago," Sheriff Morgan reported from the doorway. "Heading east. Seems they don't want any part of Maxwell's vendetta, now that the truth's out." "Smart men," Marcus nodded. "Question is, Jack, what are you going to do?" The young man stood slowly, his father's letter carefully folded and placed in his shirt pocket. "I spent my whole life hating you, training to kill you. Can't just let that go in a day." "Not asking you to," Marcus replied. "Just asking you to. Think about what you're fighting for. Revenge is a poor foundation for a man's life. Trust me, I know." Sarah stepped forward. "Stay," she suggested. "Stay and help us fight Maxwell. Not for revenge, but for justice. Real justice, not the kind that comes from a gun." Jack looked at her, then at Marcus. "Why would you trust me after everything?" "Because your father, for all his faults, believed in paying his debts," Marcus answered. "That letter proves it. Now you've got to decide. Are you your father's son or Maxwell's puppet?" The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Finally, Jack straightened, some of his father's old pride showing through. "Maxwell used my father, used me, used everyone he could to cover his crimes. Reckon there's a debt there needs paying." "Then I've got work for you," Marcus said. "But first you need to understand something. This isn't Thunder Valley. We don't fight from the shadows here. We stand in the light, protect what's ours in plain sight. And if Maxwell brings his army, then we'll meet them as free men defending our homes, not killers seeking revenge." Marcus extended his hand. "What do you say, boy? Ready to learn a different kind of strength?" Jack hesitated, then clasped Marcus's hand. "Teach me." As they walked out into the street, Sarah caught Marcus's arm. "You're taking a big risk, trusting him." "Took a risk on me once," Marcus reminded her. "When a broken gunfighter showed up asking to be your blacksmith. Sometimes a man needs a chance to forge himself anew." The sun was setting over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. In the fading light, Marcus, Cole, and Young. Jack Turner walked toward the forge, where Daniel waited with eager questions and an apprentice's hope. Behind them, Sarah Bennett watched, understanding that sometimes the greatest battles aren't won with guns, but with truth and trust and the courage to change. Maxwell would come. That was certain as sunset. But when he did, he'd find more than just the ghost waiting for him. He'd find a town united, a truth unveiled, and a legend reborn, not in violence, but in redemption. The forge fire beckoned, ready to help shape one more transformation. 3 days passed in a fever of preparation. Willow Creek transformed from a peaceful frontier town into an armed camp, though Marcus insisted they maintain their daily routines. "Fear's what Maxwell wants," he'd told them. "Best way to fight back is to show him he hasn't changed who we are." The forge rang with constant activity, but now it produced more than just horseshoes and plowshares. Marcus and Jack worked side by side, turning iron into makeshift defenses, metal plates for reinforcing doors, caltrops to slow charging horses, specialized tools that could serve as weapons if needed. "My father taught me to shoot," Jack said, hammering a piece of glowing metal, "but he never taught me to create anything." "Most men find it easier to destroy than build," Marcus replied, studying Jack's work. "That's why we're doing this first. Before I teach you anything else, you need to learn the value of making something with your hands." Sarah had turned the schoolhouse into a command center, much to Sheriff Morgan's amusement. Maps covered the walls, marking likely approaches and defensive positions. She'd even organized the older students into messenger teams, ready to carry warnings or calls for help. "Teacher's got a tactical mind," Morgan observed to Marcus. "Reminds me of someone else I know." "She sees patterns," Marcus agreed. "Sees how things connect. Maxwell won't be expecting that." Word came from friendly towns up and down the territory. Maxwell had been recruiting gunfighters, outlaws, anyone with a grudge and a gun. Promises of gold and glory pulled them in like moths to flame. "How many?" Jack asked during a war council in the forge. 30, maybe more," Morgan reported grimly. "Some real hard cases among them. Dalton crew, what's left of the border raiders, even a few Comancheros. Numbers don't tell the whole story," Marcus reminded them. "Maxwell's men fight for gold. We're fighting for our homes." Daniel, who had refused to be left out of the planning, spoke up from his corner. "Mr. Cole, what about the mine tunnels, the ones that run under the east end of town?" All eyes turned to the boy. "What tunnels?" Morgan demanded. "Found them last month while exploring with some friends. They're old, but solid. Come up right behind Peterson's store." Marcus's eyes lit with sudden understanding. "Just like Thunder Valley," he murmured. "Maxwell's got a pattern, always leaves himself a back door. Daniel, show me these tunnels." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Marcus, Jack, and Daniel explored the abandoned mine workings. The tunnels were indeed solid, shored up with old timber that still held strong. "Maxwell will know about these," Jack said, studying the layout. "He always does his research." "Counting on it," Marcus replied. "Question is, how do we use that against him?" Back in town, Sarah had another concern. The women and children need somewhere safe if things go bad. The church basement isn't defendable. "The tunnels," Daniel suggested excitedly. "We could hide everyone down there." But Marcus shook his head. "Too risky. If Maxwell finds them, we'd be trapping our people. No, we need something else." "The forge," Jack said suddenly. "It's the strongest building in town. Walls are half stone. With those metal plates we've been making—" "Could work," Marcus agreed. "Sarah, can you organize it? Get supplies laid in, make sure everyone knows the plan?" "Already working on it," she smiled. "Though I plan to be above ground when the fighting starts." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Need you with the others. You're the only one they'll listen to if things get bad. And you need someone to watch your back," she countered. "I can shoot as well as any man in town. Better than most," Morgan added helpfully, earning a glare from Marcus. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as Maxwell's army approached Willow Creek. The setting sun cast their shadows long before them, making their numbers seem even more imposing. Marcus counted at least 40 riders, their weapons glinting in the fading light. "Positions," he called out quietly. The defenders of Willow Creek melted into doorways and behind barricades, their movements practiced from days of preparation. Jack Turner stood at Marcus's right, while Sheriff Morgan took the left flank. Maxwell rode at the head of his army, still wearing his banker's coat despite the trail dust. His cultured voice carried clearly in the evening air. Last chance, ghost. Surrender yourself and the town doesn't burn. You always were a poor liar, Howard, Marcus called back. We both know you can't leave witnesses this time. The army spread out across the street, their horses nervous in the tense silence. Marcus noticed they kept clear of certain areas, spots where he and Jack had buried their improvised defenses. Got 40 guns against your 20, Maxwell sneered. Even the ghost can't beat those odds. Already did 20 years ago, Marcus replied calmly. Or did you forget how Thunder Valley ended? Maxwell's face twisted with rage. Thunder Valley, I'll show you Thunder Valley. He raised his arm to signal the attack. But Marcus had been waiting for this moment. Now, he shouted. The defenders of Willow Creek struck first. Hidden sharpshooters on the rooftops opened fire, while others threw bottles of coal oil between Maxwell's men, creating corridors of flame. Horses reared in panic, throwing riders into the carefully planned killing zones. Push them east, Marcus ordered. Toward the mine tunnels, Maxwell's men found themselves being herded, caught between fire and bullets. Some tried to charge the barricades, only to have their horses stumble on hidden caltrops. Others wheeled toward the east end of town, exactly as planned. They're running, someone shouted. No, Jack said grimly. They're regrouping. Maxwell's. Too smart for a frontal assault. Sure enough, the attackers pulled back beyond rifle range. Maxwell could be seen gesturing angrily, reorganizing his forces. Marcus met her eyes, seeing understanding there rather than judgment. Working iron's honest work, Miss Bennett. The only thing it kills is ignorance and rust. He turned back to his work, but his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. A man who shapes metal instead of drawing blood. He can look himself in the mirror come morning. Can't say the same for other trades I've known. Suddenly shots rang out from the direction of the bank. The sound shattered the peaceful afternoon like breaking glass. Marcus was moving before he consciously thought about it, his body remembering. Skills he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The old instincts flooded back, calculating angles, counting shots, mapping cover points. Daniel, get in the back room. Miss Bennett, stay here. His voice had changed, taken on a harder edge that Sarah had never heard before. But Sarah was already at the window, her face pale but determined. Mr. Cole, they're shooting at the bank. Sheriff Morgan's pinned down behind the water trough, and I think Deputy Hayes is hit. Marcus reached beneath his workbench, hesitating for just a moment before pulling out a hidden compartment. The wood slid back smoothly, well-oiled despite years of disuse. Inside lay an old gun belt, the leather, still supple and dark. The ivory-handled Colt gleamed dully in the forge light, its barrel inscribed with delicate scrollwork that looked suspiciously like the kind that adorned his finest metalwork. Mr. Cole. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. She stared at a gun as if it were a snake about to strike. Sometimes, he said quietly, buckling on the gun belt with practiced ease, a man has to become what he's tried to forget, to protect what matters now. The weight of it felt familiar, too familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend who'd tried to kill you once. He moved to the door with a grace that belied his age, the old weight on his hip as familiar as a curse. Outside, more shots echoed down the street, followed by screams. Wilson's gang had brought friends. He counted at least 6 horses tied outside the bank. The street had cleared except for Sheriff Morgan, who was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, and Deputy Hayes, who lay too still near the bank's front steps. "Stay here," he told Sarah firmly, "and keep Daniel in the back room. Whatever happens, don't come out until it's quiet." "Marcus," she caught his arm, and for the first time used his given name. "Be careful. This town needs its blacksmith." He gave her a grim smile that held no humor. "Careful got left behind in Thunder Valley, Miss Bennett, along with a lot of other things." He touched the ivory grip of his gun. Sometimes the only way to preserve peace is to remember how to wage war. As he stepped out onto the street, moving with the fluid precision of a man half his age, Sarah Bennett finally understood why they had called him the Ghost. Marcus Cole seemed to fade into the shadows, becoming something else entirely. Something dangerous, something deadly. Even the way he walked had changed, each step measured and silent, like a mountain lion stalking its prey. The gunfight that followed would be talked about in Willow Creek for years to come. Those who witnessed it spoke of how the quiet blacksmith moved like smoke between buildings, his shots coming from impossible angles. They said he never wasted a bullet, never made a wrong move. They said he was like a ghost, there and gone before you could blink. But that was still to come. For now, Marcus Cole walked down the dusty street of Willow Creek, every step taking him further from the peace he'd built, and closer to the man he'd tried so hard to bury. Behind him, the forge fire burned low, waiting for his return. If there was anything left of the blacksmith to return after the ghost finished his work. Sarah watched him go, the school bell he'd fixed sitting forgotten on the workbench. She understood now why he'd chosen to work with iron. It was the only thing strong enough to forge a new life from the ashes of the old. But as the gunfire intensified, she wondered if any amount of honest work could truly reshape a legend. The sun climbed higher over Willow Creek, and somewhere in the shadows the ghost rode again, drawn back into a dance of death he'd sworn he'd never perform again. The aftermath of the gunfight left Willow Creek in stunned silence. 4 of Wilson's men lay dead in the street, 2 more wounded and locked in Sheriff Morgan's jail. Deputy Hayes had survived, though Doc Harrison said it would be weeks before he could use his arm again. But it was the way Marcus Cole had handled himself that had the town buzzing with whispers and speculation. Marcus smiled, remembering similar lessons from his own past. The boy had become quite the teacher himself. Sarah Bennett stepped into the shop, carrying her usual basket of fresh bread. Her presence brought warmth that had nothing to do with the forge's fire. A simple gold ring now adorned her hand. Marcus had forged it himself, embedding in its design a promise of peace stronger than any legend. "The territorial marshal left this morning," she announced, setting down her basket. "Maxwell and his surviving men are headed for the federal prison in Yuma. This time, they say, there'll be no escaping justice." "Justice comes in many forms," Marcus replied, taking her hand. "Sometimes it's a cell. Sometimes it's a chance to build something new." He glanced meaningfully at Jack, who was focused intently on his work. The young man had testified against Maxwell, finally clearing his father's name of some charges while accepting the truth of others. It was a hard balance, but he was learning to carry it. "Sheriff Morgan says they're considering making Willow Creek the new county seat," Sarah continued. "Says a town that can defend itself like we did deserves the recognition." "Town defended itself," Marcus corrected. "The ghost just helped a little." "Speaking of ghosts," Jack called from his workbench, "Judge Harrison sent word. They're officially closing the Thunder Valley case. All charges against my father are being amended to show Maxwell's involvement. History's being set right." Marcus nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. 20 years of shadows were finally fading in the light of truth. The ghost of Thunder Valley could rest, leaving behind a legacy not of fear, but of protection and redemption. Daniel looked up from his work, his young face serious. "Mr. Cole, are you really never going to wear your gun again?" Marcus touched the ivory-handled Colt, now mounted on the wall above his forge. "A tool's only as good as the man using it, boy. Same goes for guns as hammers. But I've found I prefer tools that build rather than break. Besides," Sarah added with a smile, "a good blacksmith has other ways to handle trouble." As if to prove her point, the shop door burst open. A rough-looking stranger stood there, hand hovering near his gun. "Looking for the ghost," he announced. "Heard he's been seen in these parts." Marcus didn't even look up from his forge. Ghosts. Retired. But if you're looking for work, I could use another hand around the shop. Pays fair, works honest. The stranger blinked, thrown off balance by the calm response. His eyes took in the scene, the peaceful workshop, the students at their benches, the gun mounted like a relic above the forge. Whatever he'd expected, to find this wasn't it. I'll think about it, he mumbled, backing away. Doors always open, Marcus called after him, to those looking to change their path. As the stranger rode away, Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand. You're getting quite good at that. At what? Offering hope instead of fear, building bridges instead of burning them. Marcus looked around his shop, at Jack finding redemption in honest work, at Daniel learning to create rather than destroy, at Sarah bringing light to what was once darkness. Reckon I learned from the best, he said softly. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, making the forge fire dance. Outside, Willow Creek went about its business, children playing where once bullets flew, neighbors greeting each other without fear. The legend of the ghost had been transformed, just as Marcus Cole had been transformed, by the simple power of love, truth, and the courage to change. Time to bank the fire, Marcus announced. Tomorrow's soon enough for new work. But as his family, for that's what they had become, prepared to close the shop, a faint smile touched his weathered face. Some fires, he knew, never really died. They just changed form, like iron in the forge, becoming something new, something stronger, something meant to last. The ghost of Thunder Valley had finally found peace, not in the shadows of legend, but in the warm light of a blacksmith's forge, where every strike of the hammer wrote a new story of redemption. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legend of all.